But my name is Allison Aubuchon. I am a State Director of Communications for the Foundation for Excellence in Education with a focus on Florida. And we're here to talk about communications because it is so important to the work we do in education reform. It's such a wonky topic. It's a very confusing topic a lot of the time, but it's really important for all of us to remember our audience and remember that we're talking to them, especially to parents and teachers, and keeping them in mind as we are crafting our messages. And so the focus of today is going to be on those two things, on crafting our message and thinking about our target audience. And we have three fantastic people here with me. We have Faye, Kristen, and Dave. I'll introduce them a little bit further in a second. But we want you to leave here today feeling a little more equipped, a little more confident with some actual take-home tactics that you might be able to put into action no matter what budget, regardless of if you even have a budget, things that you feel like you can actually implement when you go to your state back home. And also, this is not about any particular reform, whether it's digital learning, higher standards, accountability, educational choices. These are all things that we've learned, lessons learned, experiences, and expertise that can really apply to anything when you're communicating, especially to the parent and teacher audiences, and how to better hone in on the faces and voices of reforms, because telling that story with actual real stories is so important. So to give you a little background about my experience in Florida, I've had the pleasure of working with the foundation on a couple of initiatives that communicate to our audiences about how far we've come in Florida. Like many states, Florida is in a period of transition. There are a lot of changes happening with new assessments and higher standards, and as we communicate these changes, it's also very important to talk about how far we've come. Florida is a state that really has seen tremendous student gains, especially since 1999 with the A+ plan, and Faye was a part of an effort in Florida called Learn More, Go Further that was effective in communicating those improvements, and we know that Floridians are now a little more aware of how well our schools and our teachers and our students are doing. And so she's going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. We have Dave, who's with Tennessee SCORE, who's more on the coalition building expertise. Dave is Executive Vice President over at Tennessee SCORE. It's the Tennessee State Collaborative on Reforming Education. He has a great combo background of both public policy and public relations, so thanks for bringing that to us today. And we also have Kristen Anderson. She's a fellow Gator, so she can sympathize with our season, and we still love them no matter what. Yes, and she's co-founder of Echelon Insights, which is an opinion research firm. You may have seen her on various talk shows. She's kind of a little bit of a star, and she's also just fantastic. She's actually a fellow or resident at Harvard's Institute of Politics, so that's got to be a lot of fun. Faye is a third grade teacher in Florida in Pasco County, and she's also a new mom like me. I think they're both about to celebrate their first birthdays, which is very exciting. And she's been teaching in Florida for more than 10 years, and of course was involved in our initiative, and also is a part of They Can Learn It, which you may want to talk about and share with everybody. So I'm going to start things off by introducing Kristen with the topic of how do we really hone in on our audience, because that's the first step.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to come here and speak with you all. The work that you're doing is so incredibly important to make sure that kids in our country are getting a good education, that they're getting equipped with the skills they need to get jobs that will pay well and will lead to fulfilling lives. And so the work that you're doing to sort of fix the system and make it better for kids is so important. What I want to talk about today, I've sort of got 3 points to help you hone in on your audience and make sure that you've identified sort of the right people for the right message with the right medium. The first point that I want to drive home is to really understand the communications pipeline that you're working with. Oftentimes, folks will want to communicate with parents, and they'll go kind of directly to those parents as, a large organization or as a school district without understanding which messengers are most trusted by parents. And if you look at who parents trust most, it's teachers. And then if you look at who teachers trust most, it's principals. And so there's this interesting pipeline where if you're looking to communicate about something that you're doing, about a reform or a change that's happening in your community, recognizing that the best way to sort of leverage existing networks and existing trust is to make sure that you're giving principals the right message, that the principals have effective ways to communicate to the teachers within their buildings, and then teachers have the tools to communicate that to the parents is really, really important. In the absence of that kind of a pipeline, or if there's a breakdown in that pipeline, then all of a sudden other sources of information that may not have good information can really intervene. Suddenly, the discussions that are happening in the teacher's lounge that may not necessarily reflect the accurate picture of what your policy changes or your messages can begin to take root. And so making sure that you're leveraging that existing pipeline of trust is important. And that's something that I found in research across the years in district after district after district. The second thing is to make sure you're choosing the right channel. In some research that I did working with Allison, we tested out a variety of different mediums for conveying messages. Did parents want to hear things over the radio? Did they want to see a story on television? Did they want to see something mailed to their home? What were they really looking for? And we found very broadly that sort of written mediums were better than anything that you would hear or sort of see on TV. That particularly when it comes to changes that are going to affect their children, they want to see it in writing. And so understanding that particularly if you have something complex to try to convey, trying to oversimplify it and convey it through more broadcast medium may not necessarily get you the level of detail that parents are looking for and may not come with the sort of credibility that they want. So understanding how to match the complexity of your message and the substance of your message with the right kind of medium that is the most appropriate for it is important for making sure you have maximum credibility. And last but not least, it's important to really make sure you're keeping your messaging about the kids. And this seems very obvious. We're all here because we want to see education better for students. But too often, it's very easy to get bogged down in the policy, to get bogged down in the data, to get bogged down in the things that we all know are very critical, but that sometimes can seem 2 or 3 steps removed from what is happening in a child's life or a child's education. Frequently, anytime I've ever done any kind of message testing, and there are messages that are about process, there are messages about how a policy change will affect the adults, those are not as well remembered, they're not as well received, and they don't change minds and resonate nearly as much as talking about how a policy change or how some kind of achievement or milestone has really affected the students. So whether it's making sure that you understand the communications pipeline that you're dealing with and that you're finding ways to get your message in at those most effective points in that pipeline, making sure you've chosen the right channel with which to enter that pipeline, and making sure that your message content itself is really focused on the kids and sort of has that emotional resonance with it is absolutely key.
Thank you so much. Dave, can you tell us a little bit about your experience and some tips?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thanks again for having me here. Just want to provide real quick a little bit of context on the perspective that I bring. So I work for Tennessee SCORE, as Allison mentioned, which is a state-based education reform research and advocacy organization that was started by Senator Bill Frist in 2009. And so I really come at this work from kind of an on-the-ground, in-the-state perspective. And I know we have many Tennesseans who are here in the room today who share that experience as well. When we think about communications work at SCORE, as it relates to not only kind of what messages work, but also specifically the tactical ways that we take those messages and use them, I think there's sort of 4 big things that I would think about. And some of these are very similar to what Kristen mentioned, which means that we've seen our polling and we know what works, which is good. The first, as she mentioned, is making the conversations that we have about kids is absolutely critical. The interesting thing is sometimes we can look back and see the things that we said about the conversations that we have or the discussions or the debates that we're having about education. Sometimes it's amazing how little we use the words students or children or kids. And I think that's a really profound thing. And I think anytime, what we try to do is in any kind of media communication we have, any communication we have with stakeholders in the state, with policymakers, we always try to use those words, get it back to students. The second thing is to talk about impact and not process. particularly when we talk about legislation or policy, we really, as reformers, we love to talk about the process, right? Like, how did we develop this assessment, right? And all these different components of how we developed it, but we don't talk enough about what the assessment actually does for kids, right? What's the impact of that assessment? So second is impact. The third, and we heard a great example of this, the first thing this morning, is telling a story, right? And I think this is something we often overlook because we assume that we just sort of understand why we're all doing this work. But I think telling a story is absolutely critical. And then the fourth thing, which I think I can maybe speak to specifically, is the power of collaboration in the conversations that we're having. In Tennessee, one of the things that we try to do as a state-based reform organization is be sort of super collaborative in our approach to doing this work. We sort of have a phrase that we use internally is that we're bullish about collaboration, which I think kind of, collaboration isn't always the most sexy word, but we're bullish about it. And so for us, that means building coalitions, continually building coalitions around the work that we're doing, centering those coalitions on students, on impact not process, and on telling a story about how we've gotten to where we are. So I'm sure we'll talk about this more, but sort of that last component, sort of coalition building, is something that I'm pretty passionate about, and not even in the sort of traditional sense of kind of political coalition building, right? But also, how do we engage teachers as a coalition? How do we engage stakeholders, advocates as coalitions? And really then using those coalitions to not only share messages, but really sort of push the ball forward in the work that we're doing. So great to be here and look forward to exploring all of those topics further.
Thank you. And one other thing I would add is giving teachers credit. I think everything you mentioned was great. And we've also learned that when you engage teachers more and thank them for their role in reforms, which would be nothing without them, that goes a long way in every level of communication. And so that's a great segue into Faye and your involvement. Please tell us a little bit about what you've been working on.
Sure. Well, I was so excited to be nominated for the opportunity to be a part of the Learn More, Go Further project and sharing the success that Florida's had, how well our teachers have been doing in our state, the reforms that were put in place that led to our success, and just to really promote student achievement. I really strongly believe in student achievement. I believe all kids can learn. And in fact, she mentioned They Can Learn It. That's my personal Twitter account and my social media outlets. I really want to influence the conversation because I do believe students can learn, and they just need the right resources, the right teachers. And after Governor Bush's his speech, I just said amen, because I strongly support what he's standing for, and I think great teachers really are supporting those messages. I was not the only teacher involved in this. In fact, Ryan, she's standing in the back if you can wave, she was also a part of this project, and there were two other teachers, Angela and Beth, who wasn't able to make it, but they were also involved in this, and they also firmly believe in student achievement. And so, again, we're just happy to be a part of this and sharing our state's success. And my goal today is to really encourage that unity between teachers and policy leaders, because I think there's a great sense of a disconnect. I've been talking to a lot of, and prior to coming here, I've been doing a lot of phone calls and a lot of conversations with teachers, because I didn't want to just come with just my personal experiences. I wanted to come with other teachers, great teachers, not the noise, not the complainers, those who really want to impact education and are doing a great job. And I think there's a sense of a disconnect that they feel between policy leaders and teachers, and feeling like policy leaders really aren't in the trenches and feeling what we're feeling, the successes as well as some of the struggles. And I think there's that unity that really needs to come, because we all have the same common goal. We really want to help students achieve. We want to see all of our students have a quality education. So we both have the same goal, but we really need to unite and collaborate, as David was sharing. We need to collaborate together so that our message can really go out with impact. Because if you get the teacher's voice, you're going to be very effective. So,
thank you so much. Can you tell everybody how you got involved? Because I think that's a question a lot of people have, is how do you even connect with teachers?
Sure. Well, my administrator, Suzanne Leich, she's in the audience. She is the administrator of our Day Spring charter schools in Pasco County. It's a wonderful school, very family-oriented, and the teachers really care about teaching. I moved from a private school into the charter school system, and I wasn't really familiar with that environment, but when I got there, I saw the teachers really cared. They really were teaching the students, and we were a high-performing school with our scores on our standardized assessments. And finding these teachers, sometimes it might be a challenge, but you need to continue to see where can I find these excellent teachers. And I'm going to share a few places you can find them. But I'm so excited because right now this is an exciting time. There's a movement of teachers that are actually coming out where they're wanting to be teacher leaders. You can call them teacher fellows, teacher ambassadors, teacher leaders. But I was even talking with David earlier about this. All across America this is happening. If you look on Twitter, there's this teacher leader movement, and these teachers are wanting to stay in the classrooms, not just move into principal roles or roles as administrators, but they're really looking to step into roles where they can influence not only their classes, their schools, but also their communities and even the states when it comes to policies, so that the policies can be implemented even more effectively in their schools. So these teacher leaders are who you need to look for when you're looking to convey messages of reform, because they're already spreading those reform messages on their own platforms, whether through blogging or whether through forums. They're already doing this. So aligning yourself with these teachers is going to go a long way. And so you can find teachers like this who are trying to be the change from within their schools out. You can find them by contacting your state's Department of Education, looking for their cream of the crop teachers, the ones that they know have that strong communication voice. You could also contact superintendents of districts. They know who the teachers are. They know who their teachers of the year are, the ones who have that positive outlook, the ones who are going to be problem solvers. Principals, my administrator, I was, again, honored to be nominated for this position. Organizations like Hope Street Group. There's some organizations out there who are working with these teacher leaders, and they're already, again, using platforms to spread the messages, even among teachers. They're getting teacher feedback. America Achieves. There's another one called TNTP. So organizations such as those are working with those top teachers. And you want to look for those teachers, again, who are demonstrating success in their classrooms, who are willing to stand up for reform and are already looking at their current levels to impact education on a larger platform.
Thank you. I'm going to pitch my next question to Kristen. As we're talking to teachers, to parents, to business leaders, are there ways to kind of tweak the message to make it resonate more with them? Or are there any tips that you've learned that are kind of proven and polled that you can share with everybody?
Well, so it depends on which of those audiences you're talking about. But in general, I think David's absolutely right that you want to make sure you're focused on outcomes, not process, because outcomes are what's going to get people really excited. That's what's going to get people very focused on how to bring about more change and get them excited about the work that teachers are doing. So I really think making the outcome at the center is key. But really making sure that you are communicating to all of those audiences instead of just looking for one is also essential. I am a firm believer that the enemy of reform is not the opposition. The enemy of reform is confusion and doubt. Mm-hmm. And so not having a communication strategy to an audience that very well could get engaged is particularly important, especially nowadays in a world where sort of through social media, misinformation can spread so quickly. If any of you have ever, are on Facebook, every so often things will pop up in your news feed and you think, there's no way that is possibly correct. That's such a misrepresentation of what's actually going on. Making sure that you have a strategy to be aware of when that type of thing happens. And again, that's across teachers, that's across parents, that's across just general folks in the community. Understanding how information and misinformation spreads and ensuring that you have provided not just sort of a broad platitude, but really given concrete detail around what it is that you're trying to achieve is very, very, very important for pushing back against that doubt and confusion.
Thank you. One of the things I think is an important take home for everybody is that it's okay to say things that opposition to reform uses. A lot of people use terms like the love of learning. We want to retain the love of learning and creativity in the classroom. We all want that. that those things can go hand in hand with education reform. In fact, they support each other. Cultivating creativity in the classroom and that love of learning goes hand in hand with things that we are talking about at this summit. So don't be afraid to use those same terms. And any experiences that you guys want to share on that note?
The one thing I might just add to that, Allison, I was actually talking with a former legislator from Tennessee at breakfast about this, is I think one of the things that we sometimes are scared to do as reformers is use the same tactics that the anti-reformers use, right? And so whether it's about choice or standards or assessments or teacher evaluation or any of these, sort of important topics that we're here to talk about, we always want to approach these conversations with the research and here's, give a whole bunch of different studies and what we don't sometimes do is make it emotional, right? We don't talk about what's actually happening in the classroom. Sometimes we're scared to get a little bit more aggressive, right? Or political in the conversations that we're having about these topics. And so I just wanted to share that because I think that's a really important point, is that just because sort of opponents of this work oftentimes talk or use certain phrases that we know are effective doesn't mean that we can't use them as reformers as well.
And Dave, with your coalition building in Tennessee, can you tell us a little bit about how you packaged information that made it useful to the audiences you were working with?
Sure, yeah. So for us, really the way we, and really getting very tactical here, the way we package information or communication totally depends on who our ultimate audience is. As an example, one audience that we communicate with a lot from a statewide perspective is parents, of course. And I know many of us are interested in learning about how to communicate with parents in a better and more effective way. For us, the kinds of things that have been particularly effective, the kinds of tools that have been particularly effective in communicating with parents, first, I would say, maybe most importantly, is digital advocacy. Whether that's Facebook, whether that's Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, using banner ads on websites that we know parents in Tennessee visit a lot, and really directing those places back to sort of parent-friendly and parent-focused information. This is, I think, many of you, a sort of new world in terms of how to advocate or communicate specifically with parents. But for us, digital advocacy has been one of the I think most effective ways that we've been able to communicate about a lot of the work that's happening in Tennessee with parents specifically. The second thing I would say just with parents, and this is a very basic thing, but anytime you can send things home with students is absolutely critical. So we've actually in the past partnered with our state's Department of Education to send home information about changes that are happening in the classroom directly to parents. So we produced brochures that are parent-friendly that actually went home in students' report cards, and we knew it was getting into a parent's home. So that's sort of a second strategy that I think is pretty critical. And then as we think sort of across the audiences, whether it's policymakers, whether it's the media, whether it's teachers, or other partners in the work, I think you have to really take the approach of what's actually the most effective tool to use to each audience. Because the ways that people access information and engage with information is completely different depending on the audience that you use.
Can you tell us a little more about how that worked with the report card insert? Was that through the Department of Education?
Exactly, yeah. So we actually partnered with the State Department of Education. We produced the sort of brochure, very simple brochure on changes that were happening in the classroom that we wanted parents to be aware of. Worked with the department to work through messaging and make sure that we had the right communication that we were using on the brochures, and then actually worked with both the department and specifically local school districts to then send home that information in report cards. So it was a collaborative effort that we did with the State Department of Education, and then worked directly with local school districts to get them the brochures, coordinate a day or a week that they were all going to go out together across the state, and really kind of exciting. In Tennessee, got almost 500,000 parent brochures out to parents over about a 3-week-long time period. So again, that last thing that I mentioned, collaboration, right? We wouldn't have been able to do this if we weren't in a very sort of highly collaborative environment with both our state DOE and specifically local school districts.
And Kristen, from your research, have you found that there are certain tools or certain mediums that parents or teachers find more believable or helpful in terms of receiving information?
Certainly. So for parents and teachers, primarily sort of written forms of communication were the best, whether it was getting a brochure in the mail, whether it was seeing a post on a school district website, seeing something that looked like it came from an official source that was coming from somewhere you could trust, but that was written down in a way that you could more clearly consume it, was consistently polled better than things like hearing about changes through ads placed on the radio or things on television. And so in terms of the messenger, teachers want to hear from principals and parents want to hear from teachers. But in terms of the medium, things that are written down that you can hold in your hand or see very clearly on a computer screen were outperforming those things like TV and radio that just didn't. It would be a lot harder to really grasp what does this change mean for my child in that kind of format, and so they didn't wind up polling as well.
And people are still reading newspapers, so we should still consider newspapers, right?
Well, in terms of, so then there's also a distinction between hearing something from an official source and hearing something through the local news media. So actually parents were not at all interested in hearing through local news media about changes. They kind of wanted to hear directly from the parents from the district. However, for the public, for people who don't have kids in schools, that is still an important method of communication because they don't have a child who's going to be able to come home with that brochure and the report card. So we found that the general public was very open to hearing about things in the local newspaper or on TV, but that parents wanted to hear more directly, something in writing from the school or from the district.
So ideally a combination, if you have a relationship with your Department of Education and can work with them to get into those levels of communication that happen at the different levels within education, but also a public component, which is something that Faye was involved in. Can you tell us a little more about some of the tactics that you were involved in communicating with Learn More, Go Further?
No problem. And honestly, I totally support having the Department of Education. If you're able to get in students' backpacks, that is the most direct approach to reaching parents. And I just firmly agree with that. But also, even if parents have those talking points, teachers have those talking points so that they can also convey and reinforce what's going on, that's really important, that's key. But some of the ways that I was involved, we were able to even get into a local library with the superintendent of Hillsborough County, and we were able to meet with parents and share how successful we had been in the state of Florida, but also listen to some of the concerns that parents had over our new standards, and that was highly effective. And I think because we were able to sandwich in their concerns with hope, started off with our message of hope, with how well we had been doing and the scores that we had seen and the data that had proved our success, as well as the reforms that were in place. But also, parents shared their concerns about things that were coming up, and the superintendent, who may not have been aware normally of certain issues that parents were experiencing, she was able to hear those and address them. And it wasn't a volatile experience. It was a wonderful environment. It was, everyone in the audience, behaved themselves really well. But we were able to sandwich that in also at the end by giving them some strategies that they could take home with them to help their students. So it's important to get face-to-face with our parents as well, because that'll really reach them. That personal touch really does a lot. But we also got into community events. I was part of a Hispanic Chamber of Commerce where we spoke and addressed the Hispanic population and how well they had been doing in our Florida schools. And we also attended a Cuban Sandwich Festival, and that's where the community is. You have to go where they are. And so people were, walking around, and we were handing out flyers, and hey, did you know about, how well our schools have been doing in Florida? And a lot of people weren't aware of it. So, you're going to be surprised. This is good news. And a long time ago, I thought, okay, we're still doing poorly. In fact, when I was a teacher, our students did so well. We were in the top 4% of Florida schools with our standardized test scores. And I heard from one of the students that they had shared that news, and somebody said, oh, but you're just a Florida school. Well, I didn't realize we were in the top 10 at that point. And then to find out, okay, we're in the top 4% of Florida schools, and then Florida's in the top 10, that's news I should have known as a teacher. And so the communication needs to really be there, going out, even in the community, getting out there, sharing the good news, because a lot of people don't know. So getting face-to-face with them is critical.
Allison.
Absolutely.
One of the things that Faye's comments just reminded me of is, and actually maybe before I say this, can I ask a question? How many people in the room are legislators? Can you raise your hand if you're a legislator? Okay. So we have a lot of people in the room who know about campaigns, right? Like what it takes to run a campaign. What Faye reminded me of is if we are going to effectively communicate this work, we are running a campaign. I mean, that's what this is. It is a campaign. And so as we think about the way we message, the way we communicate on any education reform issue, we have to think like a campaign. And so sort of what does that look like, right? One, it means there are different messages, different layers of the message for different audiences, right? I mean, some campaigns, they'll have a policy manifesto that'll be like 30 pages of every single policy position they have, but they also narrow it down to one campaign statement that explains from a policy perspective where they're at, right? So sort of that range of messaging. Two is, I think, sort of thinking about like what are key events, right? What are key moments along a campaign that you want to make stand out? And then finally, there is always an election day, right? I mean, and it might not actually be election day, right? It could be the end of legislative session. It could be when the report cards come out. It could be the end of the school year. But we've always got to think about in any kind of messaging or communications campaign or strategy that we're thinking about, what is election day? What's the final day that we're sort of trying to get to? So anyway, Faye's mention of sort of going out in communities and thinking about different groups. I mean, it is a campaign approach. And so regardless of what policy issue we're talking about, whether it's choice or standards or assessment or evaluation or accountability or any of these important issues, we've got to take an approach of we're in a campaign. And this is a campaign from a messaging and communication standpoint specifically.
And we have Thanksgiving coming up. This is a great time to be thanking our teachers and talking about their role in the improvements that do exist and their role in classrooms, in and out of classrooms every single day. I think it's also good to remind everybody it's okay to tweak your message based on whom you're speaking with. The business community, a lot of them are going to care more about college and career readiness. Are these reforms going to be helpful in their future employees and making sure they're prepared? For parents, are kids graduating more? They care about graduation rates. Are kids taking and passing AP exams, things like that? And so thinking about what those audiences care about is very important. And Dave, I'd love to hear from you because you had such coalition building in Tennessee. What did you share with those audiences that was kind of tweaked and customized for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So one coalition that I would sort of point to that we helped to launch in Tennessee is a coalition called the Expect More, Achieve More Coalition. And this was really a coalition that is mostly focused around standards and assessment work in the state. But the coalition, as it currently exists, is over 400 organizations in Tennessee, from the business community to education groups, to school districts, to philanthropy in the state, who are all committed to making sure that Tennessee has the highest academic standards. And so what we've actually done is then taken the segments of that coalition, which sort of roughly fall along the lines of educators or education groups, business groups, and then sort of community-based organizations, and tried to think about what are the messages that each of those three groups, what are the messages that resonate with those three groups, and I think more importantly, what are the messages that those three groups can then use in their own work, right, in their own communication efforts. So we actually create sort of very different materials that all sort of start from the same messaging and communications framework, and then we sort of customize it to messages that are relevant to the business community, relevant to educators and education groups, and then relevant to sort of community-based organizations. And what that means is you sort of have different things that kind of pull out and that come out in each of those messages, right? So business community, I mean, this is very obvious, right? But more focused on sort of workforce demands and how do we make sure that students are prepared for the jobs of the future in Tennessee, and what are the skills that we know that employers are specifically looking for, and then how does that relate to standards, right? For community-based organizations, a lot of times we'll talk about the achievement gap, right, and ensuring that students of color have just as much opportunity in the classroom as any other students, and then of course educators, education groups. Typically, those are the groups that know the most about the policies that we're already talking about. So we have the ability to get a little bit more granular in terms of the kind of messaging and the kind of communication that we're using with those groups. I would also say, like, length matters too, right? So you can't necessarily give a 5-page brief to a business CEO, right? Because they're just not going to read it. Whether it's about why they should support a policy or with the kinds of messages that they should ultimately use. Now, a teacher might read that 5-page brief, right? Because they're already invested and engaged in that work. And so I think just little things like not only sort of how you tweak the message, but how you present the message is actually a really powerful way of thinking about it as well.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we offer at the foundation, just to let everybody know if you ever need tools or resources, we would be happy to provide that for you. And you can email me personally at allison@excellened.org. But things like school newsletters, if schools need content, we're happy to help give them resources that they can tweak and make their own, or newsletters, lawmakers who have e-blasts that go out regularly. I know you have very busy staff and everybody's wearing multiple hats maybe on your staff, and so we're happy to share information that is factual and that can be tweaked and customized to fit your audiences, but we are a resource for that information. And Faye, can you tell us a little bit more about where teachers are, reading information in addition to newsletters? Are there particular blogs and things like that where they're finding information?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research on this, and there's a lot of great resources that teachers are conversing about issues related to educational policies. Some that you can check out for yourself are teachingquality.org, Mighty Bell, Edutopia. And these are places where, again, they're discussing policy issues, they're sharing their personal thoughts on these, and these are great teachers. I mean, they're not just out there complaining, they're sharing their perspective as teachers, and it's great to hear from, professionals that are in the classrooms and are discussing these topics. Facebook educator groups, I know there's another communication session that'll be happening tomorrow, and he's probably going to go a little bit deeper into Facebook. But Twitter, oh my goodness, Twitter is an amazing platform. Your states, if you want to know what your teachers are conversing about, do hashtag, do your abbreviation for your state, and do EdChat, and you'll find out what your teachers are talking about. So for Florida, it would be FL EdChat, so hashtag FL EdChat, and you'll find out what our Florida teachers are talking about. And it's really exciting because there's even schools that are creating hashtags for their teachers to discuss issues or things to help each other with professional development. There's districts that are doing this. And so Twitter is an amazing platform for teacher professionals where they're networking, even across states. And so if you really want to know where the conversation's happening, that's where it's going on. So,
and I would just love to add to that actually that's a great way for you not just to know what teachers are saying, but you can find out what parents are saying as well by looking at what's going on in terms of online conversation. As somebody who works in the polling field and the opinion research field, I mean, people they don't have landlines as much and they're not answering phones as much, but they're talking online and they're sharing their opinions there. And so you can do interesting things in terms of using social media almost as a way to test out your own message. Think about how many of you have ever heard of something called Upworthy? Okay, so some of you. So what Upworthy is it's a site, a news site that really traffics in stories that are very shareable, where they have this catchy headline that almost always is some formulation of, something happened, you won't believe what happened next. And then, you click on the link and it's some inspirational video or what have you. And these get shared like wildfire. And so, learning from what really gets shared and trying to replicate things that are very successful online, things that are inspirational, things that are surprising, that's what will get you a lot of traction online. And then you, as a communications professional or someone involved in this space, can see what's getting shared and what's not getting shared. And for those things that aren't getting shared, what can I do to tweak them to make them better? What's the difference between the things that people are really engaging with and the things people aren't engaging with? So that can be a way for you to kind of test your own message even as you're deploying it.
I wanted to just add sort of one thing about sort of social media specifically. I think a lot of times we think about social media as a way to get a message out, right? Like that's how we're going to use it. We're going to put something on Twitter, and then everybody's going to see it, and then they're going to share it, and like that's a way we're going to get a message out. One of the ways we think about social media is actually that just as powerfully, or even sometimes more powerful, is the ability to listen, right? And so to listen to what people are saying, to listen how they're talking about things, to listen to the words that they're actually using. And Twitter gives us the unbelievable opportunity to do that. So would encourage you to sort of think about, particularly as you craft messages, as you think about the way you communicate things, don't just think about social media as a way to push a message out, but also think about it as a way to listen and understand sort of what messages are used. And for those of you who are sort of interested in sort of this topic, the one book that we actually sort of required reading for folks on our team who do communications work is a book called The Dragonfly Effect. And so would encourage you all to read that if you're interested in sort of this topic of how to use social media to not only engage and get messages out, but also listen and learn from that conversation as well.
I'm glad to hear the word collaborative used so frequently on this panel. And that gets back to the coalition importance. It's hard to make a big impact alone, and so it's important to engage partners and in order to be more effective. In Florida, we have a group of organizations and individuals that we call our Florida partners, and we don't always agree, and that's okay. It's good to bounce ideas off of each other and just keep each other informed, share resources, and I think that's a challenge sometimes, is even knowing where to start in trying to build a coalition. We've had a lot of lessons learned, I think, with our groups, and I'm curious, Dave, what tips do you have in order to make a coalition something better than just a laundry list of organizations that you blast information out?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the best example that I would give of a coalition that you might think wouldn't work, but actually does, is the steering committee that actually helps to guide SCORE's work. So we have a steering committee of about 30 individuals, and these individuals are as diverse as the School Boards Association head, the Charter School Association head, the Teachers Union head, the Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, policymakers of both parties, who all come together to map out what's next for the state in education. And you would think, how does this work, right? How do they agree on anything? But I think there's a couple of things that we try to do, and sort of this is kind of in many ways sort of best practice in change management. If any of you have read John Cotter's work on how to make transformative change, these are some of the most sort of critical things that you do. And the first thing is you have to have a moment to rally people. There has to be something for people to rally around. In Tennessee, as an example, that moment for us was in 2007. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the Leaders and Laggers report gave us 3 Fs. Right? We got an F for truth in advertising, we got our F for workforce preparedness, and we got an F for achievement gap, essentially. And this was a moment when folks in our state said, hey, we have got to do something because what we're doing is not working. And I think anytime you're able to rally people around a common sort of challenge or a common moment, you have the opportunity to get beyond disagreements on potentially sort of very specific policy issues. And you're able to, which I think is the second most important thing, beyond kind of having a moment to rally around, is establishing common and clear ultimate goals, right? So let's all get on the same page about ultimately where are we trying to get to. And if you start from that moment and then you work backwards, you get a whole lot more done than saying, what's the next thing we're going to do? Because everybody's going to disagree on what the next thing we're going to do is. So, from my experience at least, sort of the 2 critical coalition activities that have been successful in Tennessee are one, having a moment that we can, having something to rally around. And for us, it was saying, we were worse than every state in the country except for Mississippi and Alabama, and that's not saying much. No offense to anybody from Mississippi or Alabama. So I mean, that was that moment. But then 2, it was starting with what are our goals, right? What are our ultimate goals? Where do we want to be in 20 years? And then how do we think about the way that we get there? We may have disagreements on specifics along the way, but at least we've all come to the table and said we want to get to this point in 20 years, and let's figure out how to get there together.
Thank you. Kristen, are there any secondary audiences that we're not mentioning that are important to kind of keep in mind that are gatekeepers to other audiences? Or
So I think particularly, and this may resonate with a lot of the legislators, but understanding that reform is inherently political, and that even that we traditionally think of our audiences as parents, teachers, business leaders, and policymakers, and trying to influence change that way. But a lot of conversations wind up being political, for better or worse, and reforms can get politicized, for better or worse. And so understanding the political context of the reform that you're trying to achieve, and understanding how those who may not be directly involved with the schools are still part of that sort of communications loop. So I guess before I called it a pipeline, now I'll make it, it's a circle. You've got your policy that the principals talk to the teachers, talk to the parents. Then you have the public, and the public is really influential with policymakers. When folks call up their legislator and say, I hear that might be what's happening in the local schools and I don't like it, that can resonate a lot. So understanding how politically engaged members of the public who may not otherwise be connected to the schools think about these issues is really, really essential these days.
And there's absolutely value in polling, and I know not everybody can have a budget for doing polling research, but are there other resources where folks can find impactful studies or things that are kind of go-to resources that you would suggest?
Well, so there is an awful lot of interesting public research that will pop up every so often. I believe there's some annual research that is done on teacher attitudes by Scholastic that is released publicly. That's an interesting resource. And then occasionally you'll look at these, New York Times, CBS, NBC, Wall Street Journal. They don't usually have education questions, but occasionally, if they ever do, keep your eye on that and see how public opinion is shifting sort of at a national level. That's another kind of free resource. But really, I am a huge advocate these days of trying to figure out how you can use these interesting social listening tools to do things. An example I'll give of something that I just did because I was curious. There used to be a site called Topsy.com, which would let you just type in some terms and see what conversation looked like on Twitter about that term over the past few days. And some of you may recall that a couple of months ago, Secretary Arne Duncan made some comments about the Common Core state standards and about how suburban moms might react to them. And so I just wanted to see what percentage of conversation on Twitter about Common Core also included the terms Arne Duncan and suburban moms, and it actually accounted for about half of the conversation on Common Core for that last week, and there had been a huge uptick in the amount of conversation. That was free. It wasn't for a client or a particular project. I was just curious. But Topsy was a free tool that was out there, and so you can look at things, find resources like that can give you digital insights about what people are saying, what they're talking about, that can let you know where the debate might be headed.
One other thing I might add on polling, I think it's important to differentiate between polling to learn what issues we should be talking about and polling to learn about how we talk about those issues, right? I mean, we do a lot of polling not because we want to know what people in Tennessee care about. I mean, there are research-based policy priorities that we know are improving student achievement in Tennessee, and those are the things that we care about. But what we want to learn is what are the most effective ways to talk about those things? And so, like, two examples that I think are just obvious ones. We talk a lot about in the reform movement about teacher effectiveness, right? I mean, like we all talk about this teacher effectiveness, and polling shows us that particularly among educators, talking about teacher effectiveness it turns people off, as opposed to, and this is sort of just a subtle difference, effective teaching, right? So the difference between effective teaching and effective teachers or teacher effectiveness, right? That is just such a small difference, but the messaging shows us that actually makes a difference in terms of how we talk about it. The other thing, I think this is a sort of very related issue, is talking about teacher effectiveness or evaluation or support as accountability. I know a lot of people talk about teacher effectiveness and evaluation and support as accountability, and our research shows us that doesn't work. Right? Let's talk about supporting teachers. Let's talk about evaluating them to provide them good information, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Not talk about that work as an accountability specific tool. And there's a whole other conversation we could have about accountability, but I think those are sort of just two examples of the kinds of things that we can learn from sort of polling messages as opposed to just sort of polling what topics we should care about.
And another idea about a way that you can try to test things like that out if you don't have the budget or the bandwidth to take on a polling project is it's actually a great lesson from smart digital communications, but in particular, there's this great anecdote from the 2012 Obama campaign where they talked about trying to put together an email fundraiser that they were going to send out, and they had about 18 different subject lines and formats for this email. And just as an exercise, they had all of the senior campaign staff pick which one they thought would yield the most donations. And everybody picked a different one. Their gut instinct, everybody's gut told them a different one would be the best. And when they actually tested it on a small subsample of the campaign's email list, the one that raised the most money was the one nobody had chosen. It was kind of ugly. It didn't look like anything they had sent out before, but that was the one that got people's attention and got them to donate the most. And so then they took that one, the one that the data told them was the best, and sent it to the whole rest of their email list. And they used that kind of testing to optimize almost everything they did. And so while, even if you don't have the budget to do a poll where you can test out different messages, maybe consider, before you send out an email to your teachers, send out, 2 or 3 different versions of it to a small, randomly selected sample of your teachers, see which ones get the most engagement, see which ones get the most, open rate, response rate, and then take the winner and use that as your message more broadly. That kind of A/B testing is something that you can do with very little, if any, expense to really optimize your message on the fly.
That's something that we've been playing with a little bit at the foundation too, through different mail services. But the A/B testing is kind of fun. We've been playing with even hashtags in the subject line. So I don't know if you have any experiences with what's worked better than others, but we tend to get more open rates with fun, short headlines rather than press release, etc. So things like, what's a PLSA? Well, gosh, someone's going to look at that and think, I want to know what a PLSA is. Yeah. So any tips on that, Dave, in particular?
I mean, the only other thing I would add, and we do the same thing, we'll send newsletters out to lists of teachers or stakeholders across the state, and we'll look at sort of which things were clicked on the most or opened the most. I mean, this is very obvious, but I mean, like, people look at pictures and they always click on videos. Mm-hmm. If you have a picture and you got a little play button in the middle of it, everybody clicks on it. And that's just a real simple thing, but pictures, videos, those always, at least for us, seem to work in terms of our email communication specifically.
Now, Faye, I want to hear from you about when do we engage teachers? Because I think that getting back to the collaboration, it's important to have talked to teachers early on, right? Not after the fact. Can you tell us about how to do that and why that's important?
Yeah, sure. Again, teachers, a lot of great teachers, like I was sharing before, they do feel like there's a disconnect between policy leaders and teachers who are in the trenches. And so it's important to not only communicate with them via social media and via some of these other platforms such as CTQ, which is the teachingquality.org, and get your voice out there with them, but actually get in person with them. And I know you can't do this with every single teacher in every single school, but I'll just give you an example. Dr. Frank Fuller from our Florida Senate, he came to our school. And that was just such an honor that someone at the state level who's, working with some of these decisions that affect us in the classroom, that he was willing to come in and sit with us and get our input. And no, he didn't agree with every single thing that we had to share, some of our ideas, but he did take some of our feedback, and he did, acknowledge those as being, things that he could perhaps consider. And so just hearing that, okay, we have a voice in what's going to affect us and our kids. I mean, we care about the kids. It's not about, protecting us as teachers. That's not the concern for great teachers. I mean, from the teachers that are really trying to really help the kids, it's not about protecting us, but we also do want to see that we can influence the policies so that they can be better implemented in our classrooms, because we know what certain things that maybe will not work as well, or maybe if we just change this a little bit, maybe it'll work better. So if we have a face-to-face, if you can find those great schools, talk to the principals of great schools that you know of, the ones that are being affected, talk to the superintendents, talk to your state department, which are those great schools that are being effective, and meet with those teachers, get in the trenches. Great teachers that I've been talking to, they say, when policy leaders come to our schools, we put on a dog and pony show, and we don't want to do that. And they want to just show you what they're doing, but just not trying to impress and show you, okay, look at, these flowery little performances that we're putting on, but look at an actual day, what it's like. Look at all the things that we're doing in our classes. Look at the challenges that we're facing, but also see the great successes that we're having. See the kids, the impact that we're having on kids' lives, because it's not just about, the inputting our, information into our little computerized kids. No, it's not about that. These are people, and we're investing in them. And so seeing that, the whole picture, and spending a day with a great teacher and hearing from them and saying, hey, listen, put your guards down. I just want to hear what life is really like for you. And because I know you're doing a great job, and really reinforce how great teachers are doing. Because again, some of the language that we're using, in different cultures, I've heard different cultures, certain handshakes and certain things are not, even with teachers, certain things that we say, wordage that we use. Effective teaching, oh my goodness, I can get excited about that. Teacher effectiveness sounds like you're kind of pointing at me. What are the holes that I have? And so if we can really use the right language with teachers, if you can get teachers with you and align yourselves with them, you will have so much support. And I think that's where the impact can greatly happen when it comes to reform, because we all want kids to be successful. The great teachers want kids to be successful, but I think there's that feeling that you're out of touch with the teachers. And trust me, I know that you're not, because you're here. You're here because you care about good teaching. You care about good, students succeeding, like the girl who was in the video. I mean, it made me want to cry to see how far she was able to come. And so just building that relationship is so important, because if you can get the teachers, your message is going to go out.
And no offense to any media present, but I think that there is sometimes a tendency to pit education reformers and opponents of reform against each other, and painting this picture of teachers not being ever involved in education reform, and that's just not the case. And so the more we can show the faces and voices of reform and get teachers especially involved, I think the better. So we're so thankful that you're willing to do that, and our other teachers in Florida and other states getting out there. And I know it's sometimes not easy. It's definitely challenging, but it's very exciting work that you're doing. So I think we're going to open up to some question and answer right now. If anybody wants to go ahead and head to the microphone there. Okay, we'll start over here.
Quick one.
Sorry.
Whichever one. I'm a legislator from Minnesota, and we talked about campaigning, and I hear a lot of positive message. In campaigns, there's a negative message out. How much negative messaging should we do or not do?
That is an outstanding question. I think it depends on, first of all, who the messenger is, right? I mean, from my perspective, or the organization that I work for, we would never use negative messaging. Now, we might use strong messaging, but we would never use negative messaging. And I think regardless of the kind of messaging that you use, I would encourage you to remember the first thing that I talked about earlier, and that's talk about kids. Talk about what's happening in the classroom. And if you decide that you want to use negative messaging, talk about what's not happening in the classroom, or what's happening in the classroom that's going the wrong direction rather than the right direction. Other folks on the panel may have different perspectives, but from my perspective, we would not use negative messaging. We might use strong messaging that's focused on kids and what kids are getting or not getting. But we wouldn't use negative messaging, I don't think.
Kristen, any advice on that from experience?
I think that's a very sound advice that you've given. Because the goal here is not, I suppose in some cases you may have a binary outcome where it's either a policy is or is not implemented. A lot of this will be, incremental change that's not leading to just sort of a zero-sum game, that it's leading to something that's going to be good for students, and where kind of everybody wins at the end. And so, I would second that note of caution about being negative, and instead, the absence of positive change is in and of itself a negative thing. And so talking about the seriousness of the absence of change is I think, certainly on the table. But that would be my recommendation.
And sometimes the facts that are negative, unfortunately, are a healthy wake-up call. but also explaining, what needs to be done, and that there are results that can be shown and proven with effective policies to get to that next stage. So, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's go over here.
Hi, Nancy Pels-Paget with the Aspen Institute's Education Policy Program. I have two related questions to the one that just took place. One is, I heard you talk a lot about the voices of teachers as an effective tool, as well as being collaborative and having conversations, but I'd be curious if you have some methodology or some ideas about voices of students, because we haven't seen much of that, and I'd love to know where you see them fitting in, what the best use is. And the second one relates to this negative, which is if you're entering the social media space, and we have not, we've decided that it agitates more than it provokes and promotes, because we're worried about saying things that then generate lots of chatter, but it isn't positive. So any advice on how you enter the space to do it with promoting the most productive dialogue, as opposed to the kind of mythology and exchanges that aren't really based on good information?
I'll just touch on the student voices real quick. That I totally agree. I think that's an audience or a voice that is not utilized, or maybe we're not reaching out to them enough to share their stories. Obviously, they're in classrooms with teachers every day, and it's their lives that we're talking about. There are certain policies, I think, like educational choices, that lend themselves more easily to sharing those stories, because there are families that are very passionate and that are willing to talk about those stories. Things like testing, there indeed are some kids that we've been in touch with who are willing to even author op-eds about how accountability in testing has been beneficial in their lives, but I don't think that that's an easy task necessarily, finding and reaching out to them. And my suggestion would be going to the school level or going to the parent level, of course, to find those voices. Faye, any advice on finding student voices?
Well, yeah, you definitely want to go to those schools, such as like my charter school. I would definitely recommend, going to our charter school and speaking to parents, because our children are willing to get out there and do things like that. But even like the example of the video that they showed in our opening presentation, that's just an example where you have that little negative part at the beginning where you share where her family came from, but you don't really focus on that. You focus on where she's going and how far she's come. And if you can find those voices and use those and just mimic what they did at the beginning of the presentation, mimic that. See if you can find those voices in your communities, those great schools that, the children have graduated. And now, we have students already talking about our school. They graduate and they'll write little things about how far they've come and how Dayspring has really helped them, and that's powerful. That's a powerful message, because it's coming from the kids themselves. And I know the negative voices. My husband and I are so into like educational documentaries, and we saw they took children's negative voices and they used them against testing, and you know what? You can also use those students who really are high achievers and who really want to do their best, and they're top performing students and they're going somewhere, and use those voices and take that message in a totally different direction.
Two thoughts real quick just on how to engage students and what that looks like. We at SCORE, one of the members of the steering committee that I talked about is actually a student member. And so typically it's a senior in high school who gets referred to us by one of the superintendents that we work with closely, who's either been involved in stuff that the district's been doing or has presented to the school board before, or sort of has some engagement in this work already. And one of the interesting things that we've found, I know we have a couple folks in the room from Tennessee who are actually on our steering committee, is that voice is the voice that keeps everybody honest, right? It's like we can get down a rabbit hole talking about a whole bunch of different policies, when that student speaks up, it's like it's a breath of fresh air, right? It's a perspective that nobody's thought about before. It's a totally different perspective. It may or may not be something that we can act on, right? But it's always a new and different perspective. And so I think figuring out the right place for that voice to fit in, to keep us honest and to keep us focused, is actually really important. And then the second thing I would just say is I think anytime sort of back to sort of these key strategies, telling a story. There's nobody better to tell a story than a student, particularly a student who's actually been through the pipeline already. So, right, if you've got a student who's in post-secondary education, or you have a student who's graduated post-secondary, they can look back and talk about what they got or what they didn't get, what they'd like to have had that they didn't have, what they did have that they wish all kids had. I mean, that kind of story, I think, could ultimately be pretty powerful.
I'll try to tackle the second question just really briefly about
Yeah.
the social media engagement. I would encourage you not to unilaterally disarm on that front. That even though there's going to be, even though the social media, it's kind of the Wild West. You can't really control or manage too much what goes on there. You can only manage what you say. You can't manage how people choose to engage with you. But I would be nervous about not engaging at all,
Right.
because opponents of reform are there, and what I would say is that in addition to, don't just think about it as social media is where people go to agitate. While that's certainly true, they also go to share things that they think are remarkable, whether it's sharing a picture of the remarkable looking French toast they had at brunch, or it's sharing the remarkable thing that, this miraculous thing that they, somebody took a video of and they just had to share it. So what are the remarkable things that you can share in a positive way on social media? You're not going to be able to make the internet completely a happy place, but I wouldn't leave the battlefield entirely.
But one thing I might add to that, you can't just, I'm trying to think about how to say this in a polite way. You can't just do a little bit and think it's going to work.
Right.
Like you can't just, oh yeah, I like tweet once a day and now I'm going to have thousands of followers who are
It's
going
not if you build it, they will come.
Right, yeah, like that's not how it works. And so like I think if you are going to decide, hey, we want to do this work, there is a you have to invest in it. I mean, it really is. We are no longer in a world where it's like, hey, we're going to do all this communications work, and we're going to have a communications team, and we're going to do paid media, and yeah, we're going to have the administrative assistant, just tweet 1 or 2 times a day, and that'll be our social media strategy. Like that does not work. And so in that scenario, I would encourage you, it's not worth your time. Just don't do social media. But if you're going to do it, you really do have to think about how do you invest in it in the way that's actually going to move the ball forward.
And if you can have a built-in audience of folks who are already kind of like-minded and looking to share your views. So right now to use sort of political-ish examples at the moment, kind of on the center left is Vox.com, and on the right they've tried to create one called the Daily Signal. The idea is they create these graphics and these charts that say, here are the 3 data points that prove the Affordable Care Act is working, or here are the 3 data points that prove we're in too much government debt. And they create these charts, and then people who are like-minded and are really interested in winning an argument with their friends on Facebook, you've given them something they can use and share and say, look, I was right all along. Here's this fact from the Aspen Institute that shows why this reform is such a great idea.
And
Thank you.
social media is something we're going to get into tomorrow on the session 10 panel, so I hope everybody here today can also attend that. And as far as positive, hashtag, if you have any positive stories about students and teachers in your state, we've started to use the hashtag Give a Gold Star, especially helpful this month during Thanksgiving, so please help share those positive stories with that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name is Jim Boyle. I have my own public affairs consulting firm. I want to talk about this question of process versus outcome that a couple of you brought up, that it's more important to talk about outcome than the process. And I get that, and I get the reasoning behind it, but isn't there a danger of falling into a trap when the outcome doesn't change? In the case of schools that are trying to improve and the outcomes remain the same, well then what's so great about this school? Or in a broader picture, I often see the media comparing test scores or whatever it may be, and then the conclusion is, well, there's no difference between charter schools and traditional schools, or whatever the comparison might be. And so don't you need to talk about what you're doing as well as the outcomes? Because after all, you have to change the process in order to change outcomes.
Yeah, so, and Kristen may have good thoughts on this too. I think yes, and it also depends on the audience, right? I mean, like some audiences that you're talking to are gonna want to know how the process worked and what were the steps along the way. I think for me, the best example I can give of sort of this discrepancy between process and impact is when we talk about assessment, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about assessment. We have new assessments that are rolling out across the country, and I find that a lot of times, even to audiences that just want the most basic information. We spend our time talking about how the test was created, who were all the people that were on the group of creating the test, how long did it take, what are the different timelines of when the different field tests rolled out. That's what we spend most of our time talking about, as opposed to saying, this test is going to change the way we are assessing our students. Kids are actually going to be engaged in taking a test. We're going to provide teachers with information they've never had about how a student is doing throughout the course of the school year. So I totally agree with you that we do need to talk about process, particularly when it's not about a specific policy, right? When we're talking about outcomes, sometimes we do need to talk about how we got there or how we didn't get there, right? Like what we missed along the way. But I think particularly as we think about sort of policy changes or specific policies, I would encourage us to always start with what's the actual impact of that policy or of that change instead of just focusing on the process. So.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. I'm very sorry. We'll go over here.
Good morning. Dr. Linda D'Ivermois from Learning Forward. One short question and then one that might be perhaps better for tomorrow. I'm embarrassed to ask, but what ranking does Tennessee now have?
Thank you for that question. In education?
Yes.
So first, we love Learning Forward, and you all are coming to Nashville for your conference, I think, next month. So looking forward to having you in the volunteer state. Very exciting. For those of you who don't know, Tennessee last year on the NAEP assessment was actually named the fastest improving state in the country, along with Washington, D.C., which is not a state, so we can say we are the fastest improving state in the country. But traditionally, when I was growing up, I went to public schools in Tennessee, and the big joke was that we were the last, we were 49th, 48th. The legislators here from Tennessee know that. Everybody's heard it. We're 49th, 48th in the country. The exciting thing for us is we've moved rapidly over the last 3 or 4 years, and I think the last NAEP test showed that we're now 34th, I think, in fourth grade math, in the 30s on I think 3 of the 4 sort of fourth grade math, fourth grade reading, 8th grade math, 8th grade reading. 3 of those 4 now in the 30s instead of the 40s. But as our governor will tell you, it's great to make progress, but we're not content with being just the best of the bottom half. So.
Thank you. And this question might be better to wait for tomorrow, but we have a concern with, and I totally agree with getting the teachers as teacher leaders and to use social media. My concern is with those that think they're teacher leaders who put things out there on social media and have a following when they're not actually teacher leaders. And that can wait till tomorrow if you'd like.
I think we will dive deeper into that tomorrow. We have some experts who will be very helpful on that. But I do hope everybody leaves here today feeling a little bit more confident and feeling like you have a few more tools in your toolbox in terms of ideas for communicating and tips. Tomorrow, like I said, during session 10, we'll dive a little deeper into the delivery of the message. We'll have some really great suggestions and tactics. Thank you guys so much. Also, I want to encourage you on your way out, maybe head over to the Digital Learning Lounge where you can learn about our communications MOOC, which we are launching in the spring. You can sign up for that, totally free online, open to everybody to go into these topics further. Thank you so much. Have a great time.